Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. I'm Jan van Middelaar. I'm the acting director of the program in European Politics and Society, and it's my great pleasure to welcome this afternoon Luuk van Middelaar, who is a historian and a political philosopher. A combination usually not allowed on this side of the Atlantic, but still possible in Europe. He studied in Groningen, in the Robertson Hall in Paris, at the University of Amsterdam, and he is the author of a widely acclaimed book called Passage to Europe, which in the recently published English version has the subtitle A Continent Became a Union, but at least in the French version has the, at least in my view, somewhat more or even more intriguing subtitle, History of a Beginning, implying, of course, that we're not quite done yet. He is, among other things, also in the cabinet of the President of the Council of Europe, European Council, Herman van Rompuy, and is his chief speechwriter. He is speaking in a private capacity, though, to us this afternoon. And he also, last but not least, very graciously yielded to my request to have a very low-key title, which is, of course, Europe Out of the Crisis, Eurocalypse Now, or United States of Europe. We're very much looking forward to what he has to say about that fateful choice ahead for Europe. When he's done, we'll have two commentators who I'll introduce in turn when it's their turn to speak. But for now, please join me in welcoming Luuk van Middelaar to Princeton.
Thank you, Jan, for hosting me here. Thank you to Andrew Moravcsik and Daniel Kelemen to respond afterwards, and also for you, not least, to turn up in such good numbers on a Friday afternoon. I'm very pleased with that also. As Jan said, what I tried to do in the book, The Passage to Europe, is to bring together two different experiences. One of the corridors of politics in Europe, both in Brussels, where I worked for 2 years, and also in The Hague, in the National Parliament of the Netherlands, where I also worked 2-3 years. And on the other hand, trained as a political philosopher and historian in all those places. So I tried to bring both distance and proximity to the issue. One disclaimer about the book, in which indeed I speak a lot about the European Council of Heads of State and Government as a key player in the overall genesis of Europe's political order. My disclaimer is that I wrote the book before I worked there in the years 2007 and 2008. I had never heard of the man I'm now working for, and vice versa. So that's just biographical coincidence. Of course, the challenge now, and that's why I updated the original book, which was written in Dutch in 2009, is what have the events and this massive crisis of the past 4 years meant and for the European Union. Now, what I want to do in this talk or lecture is first to show you that I studied in Paris, and you always need to have a plan in 3 parts in France. So first I'm going to briefly set the scene on the Greek European crisis. Then in the second part I'll give you some historic and conceptual background. It's really the heart of my talk today. And the third part is again looking forward on how to deal with interdependence, and there I will look at some key recent moments and summits. The first part is on the challenge, starting with the shock of that crisis itself to the European Union, which I'm not going to give the full story here, that would be too long, but just briefly, it erupted early 2010. One European government, Greece, being close to bankruptcy, which also meant trouble for the currency zone as a whole. Followed a series of summits of the last chance between the spring of 2010 and basically the summer of 2012, where very often leaders decided at 4 or 5 in the morning to take another small step to do what was necessary to safeguard financial stability and ultimately the euro itself. Well, in this crisis, both economic weaknesses in member countries came to light, loss of competitiveness and so on, unsound finances, but I won't go into that part of the story. Also institutional weaknesses, which the Union as a whole has been tried to deal with in a quite frantic activity of legislation, which seen close by is always too little too late, which was the key comment in the press, and it still is. But if you look backwards, already now in what the road has been traveled in 3-4 years, it is quite impressive change of the way Europe is organized. There's now rescue mechanisms of 500 billion euros, which were cobbled together, improvised basically as a building a lifeboat in the middle of the storm, and which represented unprecedented solidarity between member countries. There's also much stronger oversight than ever before of banks, bubbles and budgets, economic reforms in countries in trouble, budget deficits have been halved on average, work on long-term growth, etc., etc. We can talk more about all that perhaps afterwards during the discussion, and on prospects for progress. But today I want to focus on the fundamental dilemma which is still there, notwithstanding all this frantic activity and notwithstanding the fact that let's say the existential crisis to the Eurozone is over. I mean, still 1 year ago, the question was not if, but when the euro would collapse. That's at least how the Wall Street Journal wrote about it. That question is no longer there, I would say. But the fundamental dilemma is still there, I said, because at the end of the road, we still have one currency for 17 states. One central bank, 17 parliaments. One monetary policy, 17 economic policies. It's very, very unpractical. Slow decision making, incoherent sometimes, and as is said, it cannot deliver the policies which Europe needs, including policies to stimulate growth and employment, which of course are the key concerns today. Now I should, perhaps I'm allowed to point out one nuance even at this side of the ocean, that even a very simple political system like the one you have here in the United States does not always manage to avoid reckless behavior of the political class as a whole. And I vividly remember the summer of 2011, which was very dangerous in the Eurozone crisis, and which was all about putting enough money together for rescue funds, while at the same time, at this side of the ocean, there was the US fiscal cliff as another sort of breathtaking story. Now, nevertheless, the question is there, that's the second point, can't we simplify all this, make it more practical, or as it's sometimes said from here, why don't you just get your act together? Because this cannot be viable in the long run, and you should take more drastic steps in economic policy and also in a way constitutionally in terms of the political foundations of the European polity. Hence the dramatic title I chose upon recommendation of Jan Werner Müller, either United States of Europe or Eurocalypse now, unite or perish. And that line of thinking is quite strong in two circles, I would say. One circle is focusing on the growth or the economic policy aspect, the other on the democratic side. The on the economic thinking side, it is policymakers, the IMF, economic journalists, commentators. I mentioned Wall Street Journal or Paul Krugman, or who would plead for the Eurozone to have stronger a budget all by itself instead of 17 separate budget, fiscal authority, or all kinds of words are used for that. The same type of thinking also comes from Europe, and then it focuses less on growth itself, but more on democracy. And I'm thinking of, for instance, on Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, who speaks of the need, and many others, to have a political union or a federation coming alongside the economic union and repairing the design flaws in the system. And Habermas, for one, asks ultimately for a transfer of competences from the national to the European level. In fact, an unprecedented act of self-sacrifice of sovereignty by the states, which would also have to be translated in constitutional terms in the states, the member states no longer being masters of the treaty. And so Habermas wants a kind of constitutional moment for Europe, like the United States lived in 1787, a little bit further south, in Philadelphia. Now the question is, faced with these two lines of critique, economic and constitutional, some of which is totally justified, because of course the current situation is not ideal. But the question is what the price is if sovereignty of nations is given up. Is that a price worth paying? Could there not be a middle ground between unite and perish? A new way of squaring the circle between unity and diversity, which is what Europe often is about. And I call my third point against logic, and I'll share a few remarks pointing out that the euro is not just about the economy or about constitutional design. Politics is not about being in a science lab or on an OPED page, but in living history. And politicians have to deal with events, with unforeseen situations, an election, a vote in the parliament, which all of a sudden changed the whole political situation. Take the UK a few weeks ago on Syria. Red lines crossed. Politics takes place in the flow of time and has to be understood that way. And that's one of the things I try to do in my own book on Europe, is to bring this time dimension of politics also in the way we look at Europe. And to take the euro itself, that was the result also of a very specific historic situation, an encounter of an old idea to have one currency for all European nations, encounter of an idea and a specific moment, because this radical idea could only be realized after the shock of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. In a footnote, Andrew and I will maybe have a discussion about that later, but for now I'll leave it here. And the choice at the time, 20 years ago, when the euro was decided, was not to have either the perfect euro without any design flaws, birth defects, or the bad euro we have today. No. The choice was between a euro, a common currency, or nothing at all, because of all the political constraints. And that is also part of the political reality we have to grasp and where the action takes place. Final remark here: what the crisis has shown, again, just like at the moment of birth of the euro, is that the political motives to have it have sometimes trumped economic motives to either create or to keep it. And what I mean with political motives is that some of the main actors, France, Germany, some other countries, wanted to keep the euro, not only because they were afraid of the economic disaster that would happen if it collapsed, although that is partly true, but also they were afraid of political consequences, of undoing the relationships between the states that had been created over decades, about the bad effect it would have on Europe's standing in the world, about potential instability on the Balkans if Greece were to leave the euro. These kind of perhaps more ungraspable calculations played a role along the pure financial and economic ones. And one way to see that is that often there was a difference in the way finance ministers looked at the issue and heads of state and government. The finance ministers, 17 finance ministers of the Eurozone, they have a very powerful and collective body. Of course, they look at the financial side. And if it had been only for the German finance minister, perhaps Greece would have been out of the euro. But the more political considerations come into play at the level of prime ministers and presidents, who also think about, as I said, these more ungraspable motives. And at some point last summer, Chancellor Merkel decided that Greece would have to remain in, and that she would no longer hesitate. Now, to make a little bit more, let's say, convincing the fact that we do not face a fateful choice between perish or unite, I want to take a look at the way Europe has developed, and to see that the strength of the European Union and the whole European construction resides to a large extent in the way this middle ground has been formed and over time consolidated. And so now I'm going to change the scene a little bit, really zooming out, if you allow, before we zoom back in again. And as a political philosopher, I felt I had the right to really zoom out. Sometimes it helps to see more if you look at things from farther away rather than up close. So one of the questions I asked myself in the book The Passage to Europe is, does Europe exist actually, politically? And how, I mean, Europe is so many things. It is a continent, which we refer to as Europe. It's a geographical notion. It is a set of institutions. It is perhaps a culture, political system, civilization. How can we, I mean, we all feel that there is some link between what's happening in Brussels and the fact that Europe is a continent, but it's not so clear what this link is. And what I tried to do is to bring all these categories together in loosely in a model of three spheres, which are about the way European states have organized their relations among themselves. The outer sphere is is the world of diplomacy, the old European concert, the relations of war and peace, which have existed for centuries between France and Russia and Germany and England, etc. The European concert. With its balance of power. In a way that old Europe still exists. There are still sovereign states on the continent, some within the European Union, some outside, up to Ukraine. There still have been wars not so long ago in Yugoslavia, for instance. But after the Second World War, of course, 6 countries decided to do something completely new, to break with the world of war and peace after the self-destruction of the continent in the years 1940, 1945, and they wanted to build a Europe on the basis of treaties against diplomacy. And their hope was that ultimately this small start, a treaty on coal and steel in 1950, could grow both in terms of policy fields to cover much more ground, and in terms of member states to cover ultimately the continent as a whole. Now what I'm interested in is something which was not foreseen by the founders of Europe at the start, which is a discovery over time that member states share not only institutions and a treaty in Brussels, but they are also a club in the world as a group. So the middle circle, what I call the intermediate sphere, consists of the member states of the European Union together. So at the beginning, they were 6. All the other states outside. And they realized at certain moments that they had to act as a club of 6 vis-à-vis the outside world. For instance, when one of the other countries, like the UK in the early days, knocked on the door. This intermediate world is difficult to grasp in legal terms. Perhaps one reason why it hasn't been seen immediately. It is about if let's say the red world outside of the outer sphere is only about national interests, governments pursuing only their national interest, and the inner sphere is basically a promise of a world of European interests only, then in the intermediate world these two coexist. Now, in my book I'm very undidactic about this, but for the occasion of today I tried to bring together some of the concepts in a little scheme, which you can have a look at. The outer sphere is Europe, the inner sphere is Brussels, intermediate sphere, the 6 today, 28 countries, the Union, which functions, well, let's take legitimacy. It's no longer either the world of diplomacy or the world of the treaty, but that of co-responsibility for a joint enterprise. And I'll give some examples in a moment. If you, I have 2 concepts here, one transitions and the other consolidation. Very briefly, transition between the outer sphere and the intermediate sphere is basically when a country enters the club. That's enlargement in EU speak. Transition between the intermediate and inner sphere is when the rules of the club are changed, of the institutions. That is treaty revision. And in both these cases, the member states act jointly outside the treaty. This is for amateurs of constitutional thinking. The other term I wanted to introduce is consolidation. Consolidation in particular of this intermediate world. And there 2 institutions enter the stage, the Council of Ministers and the European Council of Heads of State and Government. They are the place where governments come together, sit around a table, all with their own parliaments and own public opinions back home, trying to find solutions for common problems. French Minister Schuman, Monnet, sort of the members of the official pantheon of the European Union, did not like this idea of bringing in national governments into the construction. They feared it would bring back in the old power play and rivalry between nation states, which were at the origin of the collapse of Europe in 2 world wars. This already came to a head in the very early days of the negotiations of the Coal and Steel Treaty in 1950. And it was the Belgians and the Dutch governments who had come to Paris on the invitation of France to found this new club, basically, which did not exist at the time. And were a little bit uncomfortable with the idea of some body of technocrats called high authority taking decisions, binding decisions on their coal and steel. That was the reason, by the way, that the UK had stayed at home, because it felt that such a body would be accountable to nobody. There was a clash between the original founding vision of Monnet and a Dutch negotiator. And in the end, Monnet, the founding father, said, okay, yeah, let's bring in these ministers, provided they act in concert, provided they act together. The European ideologues and federalists of the early day could live with this idea of bringing the governments in, provided there would be majority voting among them. The vote would allow to basically crash resistance. And I don't have time for it now, but the biggest crisis, to go into details, but the biggest crisis until the Euro crisis, which the European Union and its predecessors have gone through, was precisely about the vote. This was in 1965, 1966, when France, then with President de Gaulle, did not want to be subject to the risk of a majority vote on the price of wheat for their farms. And de Gaulle found a pretext to walk away from Brussels. He called back home his ambassador to the EU, which is quite a thing to do. I mean, it's like calling back the American ambassador from Tehran. I mean, it's quite a diplomatic thing to call back home your ambassador. And the French ambassador stayed, was forced back to Paris for 7 months. The whole structure seemed at risk. Now, this crisis was resolved early 1966 in, again for legal amateurs, a text called the Luxembourg Compromise, which basically was a compromise between the world of the treaty and the political notion of membership. And France accepted that it could not change the treaty to get rid of this majority rule as it had wanted, and the other 5 member countries, including Italy and Germany, accepted that a country would not have to be forced into this majority vote if it really could make the case that it was of a vital national interest. And this is interesting because this agreement has been systematically dismissed in almost all EU literature as meaningless, as basically nothing more than an agreement to disagree between these 6 governments. But in my view, it was the start of a politicization of the European order, because alongside the purely legal notions, the votes and the procedures, it brought into the structure the notion of interests, national interests were no longer taboo, the notion of time and delay, and also the notion of, or at least the acknowledgement that you need public legitimacy beyond the rules. Another moment of consolidation was the birth of the European Council, which is the place where presidents and prime ministers of all member countries gather. Again, something which had not been foreseen from the start, which was fiercely resisted for decades by the smaller countries because they feared Franco-German domination. That resistance was broken by the French in 1974 by then French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and he forced through the idea of a summit gathering on a regular basis. A place, again, where national and European interests come together. And where, when something unforeseen happens, something about which the treaty, which member states jointly concluded, does not have an answer, they could take joint responsibility. And this means that the European Council, so the body of heads of state and government, functions in a way as a sort of collective head of state, dealing with all special cases, including with crisis situations, which is, I mean, a crisis is per definition a moment which you had not foreseen, otherwise it wouldn't be a crisis. So if in Europe, which is basically a very rule-bound system about treaties and procedures, when something happens which nobody had foreseen, then you will often find that the treaty doesn't say what you have to do. It doesn't say what you have to do when a government faces bankruptcy. It doesn't say what you have to do if Iran acquires the bomb. And if you then still want to act together as a club, you have to find ways and means to organize a joint authority to take decisions. And that has been done in the European Council. Now, as a conclusion of this second part, or to sum up, I would say that member states over 6 decades have learned, experienced, discovered that Europe is not built against the member states, but by impregnating them ever more deeply, and by drawing ever more actors of the national political scene into the common game, first ministers, then leaders. And this perhaps helps also to avoid the distinctions in the literature of intergovernmentalism versus supranationalism, because it's not bad national governments versus good European institutions, or vice versa, good governments versus bad meddling EU institutions. Now, with this in the back of our mind, we can now look to conclude in a third part again at some of the events in the past few years, of some of the decisions and moments in the crisis years. And I would first look briefly at 2 crisis summit meetings. 2, for me, and this I lived up close as a counselor to the President of the European Council, which 2 of the most fascinating ones. The first is the summit of February 2010, which was when the Greek crisis had just erupted. The Greek Prime Minister said he was close to bankruptcy, and it meant a threat to the whole financial system of the whole Eurozone. Now, the problem was that it's not entirely true that there was nothing in the treaty about it, because there was something in the treaty about it, and the treaty in fact forbade to do something about it, because each country was responsible for its own debt. You were not allowed to help each other. This was the no bailout clause. On the other hand, some actors in that crisis moment did not want Greece to go to the IMF, which is what you would do if you were Argentina, because they felt that would be a humiliation for Europe to have to go to Washington basically to beg for money. And this was people like the French president, or the president of the central bank, or the president of the Eurogroup, the the Euro ministers. So they said we have to take responsibility for this jointly as Europeans. And in terms of my three circles, three spheres, you can see that this crisis could not be solved yet by the means of the inner sphere, because the rules actually forbade to do something, nor did they want to take the route of classic diplomacy, which in the case of monetary trouble means the IMF, and they decided to take joint responsibility for the situation, which resulted in I'm sorry, it's not readable, but a statement, 11 February 2010, by the heads of state or government of the European Union. The 27 heads at the time, where they say in the first sentence that they have a shared responsibility, I circled it, for the financial stability of the Eurozone, which was new. And it's on that small sentence, by these 27 leaders, that all the ulterior work of all the rescue mechanisms, etc., has been built. On that was the sentence which allowed to circumvent the treaty on this. Of course, in the later stage, the treaty has been adapted, and now the institutions are there to deal with the crisis. But at the moment of the crisis itself, the political authority had to be organized that way. Now, so I will skip the second summit I wanted to speak about, because I think I will ask the chair how long do you want me to speak for? Yeah.
10 minutes is
okay. Yeah, 10 minutes is perfect. Yeah. Well, then I can maybe try to do it briefly. That is the summit in December 2011, which is known for the veto of David Cameron to the idea of a new, stronger rule on budgets. It was a very ill-tempered summit, and the interesting thing was that the outcome on Friday morning was something that nobody wanted the day before. All players had wanted another outcome. What was at stake was to have more binding budget rules for individual governments to prevent another Greek-type crisis from evolving. So the first summit I mentioned was basically about enshrining more solidarity in the system, and the second summit was about enshrining more responsibility. The Germans wanted to change the full treaty for that, which means in some cases referendums and difficult discussions in member countries, which many governments are afraid of. And in the end, Cameron resisted this idea of changing the treaty, and the 25 of the 27 other governments decided to make a whole legal construct outside the treaty. It's called the Fiscal Compact now. 25 countries have signed it. And some legal purists are very worried that it would undermine the official construction. But I would try to propose another image which has been used, that of Europe's legal construction as a cathedral. And what the problem was countries were faced with is that they wanted to strengthen the foundations of that cathedral faced with the crisis. But they were not allowed to strengthen these foundations from the inside, within the treaty, by the Brits. What they then did was basically to strengthen the foundations from the outside. In biblical terms, you could say that rather than having been chased themselves out of the temple, in this case it were the merchants and bankers who had chased the believers outside the temple. But they came up with something interesting, which you could compare in architectural terms to the flying buttress of Gothic architecture. You know that in medieval Europe, this particular type of supporting arch was developed in order to match the ambitions of hate for building ever higher churches. And it seemed perhaps odd and shocking to those who were used to the nice forms of Roman architecture. But then again, it eventually became famous and resulted in some of the most stunning examples of European architecture. So in a way, Eurozone members also developed a similarly odd-looking innovation with this fiscal compact. And the apparent fugitives from the EU legal order were perhaps powerful architects. I'm just pushing the argument for the sake of it, of course. But it's also a way to nuance these otherwise, or to bring more political thinking, basically, in the ways some people look at the legal order. Now, a second point, I'll mention one. I'll keep it to one anecdote on the strength of the table. What do I mean with the strength of the table? The power of informal pressure among ministers or also among leaders. And I just want to bring to mind the case of the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Irina Radikova. When Jan and I met the first time, actually, she was also there at the conference. But the Prime Minister of Slovakia, a poor Eurozone country with an average income lower than Greece, but sound finances, had to pay for the Greek rescue mechanisms. And Radikova was heading a government of various parties, and she did not get her own majority together. But she was pushed and convinced by the other members of the European Council, by Merkel and Sarkozy and the others, to sign up to give more money to rescue funds. That was what was at stake. And she knew beforehand that it would cost her political life, no less, because one of her coalition parties had in exchange asked for new elections, the only condition upon which they were ready to agree, signing up for this extra money for Greece. And new elections for her, with the state of opinion polls in Slovakia at the time, was political death. And I would say that it is an impressive proof of the strength of the table that she did this, and that this bringing together of all national interest at certain moments actions for a common good can happen. The pressure of the table, as I call it, this pressure which leaders or ministers face when they sit together and have to deal with a certain situation, reluctantly, against their will often, has one weak spot, which is that public opinions back home do not feel it in the same way. Prime Minister sitting there, flying in all into Brussels, say at the moment of close to Greek bankruptcy, they feel that something is at stake. But if you then have to tell it back home at your voters in Slovakia, it's much more difficult. On the other hand, the euro crisis has made an enormous difference in the way public opinions look at Europe, and that really is a sea change, unprecedented in a way in 6 decades. Public opinions have discovered that they are interdependent, that they are all in the same boat, that what happens in Greece or Portugal matters to what happens in Finland and Austria, and vice versa, politically and economically. It has been a painful discovery, has resulted in tensions, in ugly cartoons, Merkel as a Nazi in the south, and the Greeks as a lazy lot in the north. And it translates the fact that, in fact, for the first time since when this whole adventure was started in the 50s, Europe has come so close by ordinary citizens. In the past it was something important for farmers who got money out of the common pots, for big businesses because of the common market, but not for ordinary citizens. And that has changed now that more than 300 million people have that currency, the euro. And now some commentators, let's say of the Habermas type and others, have been very pessimistic about it and proclaim that these tensions and the cartoons I just described show the end of solidarity in Europe. And I agree that these are worrying phenomena which have to be taken seriously, but perhaps placing it in perspective, it's better to speak of the fact that it is the first real test of solidarity. Because the test between the member countries, the member populations of all those in the club, has never been asked for before. It was just a matter of indifference. Polite indifference, sometimes unpolite indifference, but there was never asked a real sacrifice to pay or to do reforms because of you were in Europe or in the Europe. And if you look at it that way, and I think you can be a little bit more optimistic, also in the sense that public opinions do come to terms with the fact of that membership. And I mean the recent German elections of last Sunday are another example. As you may know, there was an anti-Euro party, new. They got close to the threshold of 5%, which is of course impressive in itself for a new party, but then again, 1 in 20 voters, or almost 1 in 20 voters, is not a populist mass movement. And coming from the Netherlands, where there's quite a strong extreme right, I know what I'm talking about. So in a way, the center holds. Now, to conclude, because Europe out of the crisis, yes, Europe is coming out of the crisis. The existential threat is over. The long-term efforts, economic efforts, are starting to pay off. But yes, it will remain complicated. It will remain a matter of muddling through. It's an imperfect world. There will be in my view, no revolutionary leap. But the path of small steps will be continued. And I think this is a very political way Europe is also dealing with this. Politics is not about, or not only about eliminating tensions. Some of them can be eliminated, but it's also about dealing with tensions, dealing with interdependence. And we do not always have to simplify matters for the sake of it. Because as Machiavelli knew, conflict and rivalry between institutions and countries can also produce freedom. Now I started with Habermas. I will give a final quote of another German, a little bit older than he, Hayo Holborn, one generation older, a German historian who fled Germany to the United States in 1934 for the Nazis. Would have been nice for the sake of the day if he ended up in Princeton, but in fact he went to Yale. I'm sorry for that. But he wrote back in 1951, "From this unforeseen novelty of the present European situation, it has also been inferred that we could forget its history altogether. But such an inference could lead to serious blunders. Yet, though the self-contained European political system has broken down," so this was 1951, "Europe's nations are not dead." And Holborn's exhortation, "A constructive treatment of Europe's present-day problems calls for historical thinking, which is," he says, "something more than mere historical knowledge." And I think that is still true.
Luuk, thank you very much for giving us a very unusual combination of an insider's view and a broad view that was also conceptually very interesting. Also a talk, unless I missed something, in which neither the European Commission nor the European Parliament were mentioned once, just as an observation. So we're very grateful and lucky to have the commentators today to react to Luuk's talk before we open it up. We have Dan Kelemen, who is a professor of political science at Rutgers, but this year actually at Princeton as a fellow of the Law and Public Affairs program, great expert on European law, and also, if I remember correctly, a great fan of your boss's poetry. And then we have as our second commentator, Andrew Moravcsik, who is, well, Andrew Moravcsik, as anybody who knows anything or is remotely concerned with the EU knows, one of the great experts of our times on the EU, and also prolific commentator on the EU in Newsweek, Foreign Affairs, and other publications. Dan,
Can we do the other order?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Sure, go ahead.
we have a different jujitsu, so should I stand up?
If you wish, sure.
Okay, so I think most people today would agree with Luuk, at least most scholars and commentators, that the EU is not a triumph of idealism over interest. It's a triumph of enlightened self-interest over short-term self-interest. It's about countries trying to manage interdependence and finding clever institutions to do it. And he's totally right about the history that, Jean Monnet and people who were idealists really got the short end of the stick. They got, the EU rammed down their throat by the member states, who dominated increasingly over time this institution through things like the Council. All that's right. So then the question is, what needs to happen for there to be what he calls solidarity inside of that kind of an institutional structure? All right, number one, there needs to be a fundamental convergence of interest among countries. You can have a few countries that are outliers a little bit and can be persuaded on the margins, but countries need to have a fundamental convergence of interest. Secondly, the adjustment costs to cooperation need to be reasonable, right? You can't force countries to do things that are really onerous. And third, the policies that are recommended need to be technocratically sound in a fundamental way, right? Now, most of the policies, when we think about the last 50 years of the EU, really fit this bill. So if you think about trade liberalization inside the EU, you think about the common external negotiating policy in the WTO, GATT, think about even the common agricultural policy. You might not like what it does, but the way it works. Regulatory cooperation, Schengen, all this great stuff the European Union has done, enlargement, it pretty much fits this bill. The issue then is, what about the euro, which is the crisis we face now? And it is also true that what Europe's done up to now in the euro crisis could be considered a kind of pragmatic, enlightened, flexible muddling through by nations negotiating with each other. The rescue mechanism, kind of unleashing the ECB to intervene, various kinds of formal and informal oversight, this kind of informal macroeconomic cooperation of various kinds. But, and here's where I start to disagree, it doesn't really deal with the fundamental problems underlying the euro system. Because the fundamental problems don't come from a lack of the proper design of the system or some kind of incomplete institutional construction. They come from fundamental diversity of interests of the member states of the euro in macroeconomic policy. Basically, to make a long story short, what happened in 1989, or more precisely, in 1987 and 1988, because these countries started committing to the process well before they had any idea there was going to be German reunification, was that Germany wanted low exchange rates, so it continued to export and coddle its export sector, which it has done for decades on end, and it wanted to be able to invest elsewhere in Europe with the capital that it gains from that trade. And southern countries wanted to lower interest rates and lower the exchange rate pressure on themselves. And one way to do that was to lock themselves into an exchange rate arrangement which would achieve that. And they had done that successively in various decades, and they kept on having to ratchet up the amount of commitment in order to make it sustainable. The tragedy is they both got what they wanted. Germans got their export surplus, they got their competitiveness, they got their ability to move capital elsewhere and lend money to other people. And those countries in Southern Europe got the low interest rates that they wanted, and they borrowed and spent a ton of money. The problem is that a system like that is not stable unless you have fundamental convergence of the macroeconomic basics of those economies. You have to have inflation rates, wage rates, competitiveness, and all kinds of other things convergent within those economies. And that's what has not happened. There hasn't been structural adjustment, to use the jargon, sufficient to make a monetary union a healthy policy alternative for countries. And that is the situation that the euro faces now. And nothing that the Europeans are doing, not banking oversight, not giving a little money to countries that are in trouble, not even looking at their budgets, because most of this is a private sector problem, not a public sector problem, is going to solve that. That is where people are now. Now, when Luuk talks about this problem, he sort of says the goal is to save the euro, and if we save the euro, we're through the crisis. But that's not the goal. The goal is to have a good policy for Europe. And the current policy for Europe isn't good. So the question is anything going to make it good? Now, what I want to do is make a pro-European argument for liquidating the euro or thinking seriously about it. All right? And I just would make the following 5 arguments in favor of it. Number 1, this policy doesn't seem to be working. I just gave the reasons why the euro doesn't seem to be a policy that's working well. To give you an example, I spent a lot of this summer at conferences with people who work on the euro. The optimists at these conferences, the pro-European, pro-euro optimists, are the people who say 10, 15 years of austerity and low growth in the southern countries are what's now necessary, right? That's the optimistic scenario, all right? And that's not a good policy. Secondly, having this kind of policy in place with low economic growth saps European power and influence in the world. And we need an important, influential Europe in the world. You think of a country like Italy that actually was growing very quickly, overtaking Britain in per capita income and so on, second largest exporter in Europe, it's now a basket case, and in large part because of the euro. Third, it wastes unbelievable amounts of political capital. So Luuk thinks it's a big triumph that the Slovakian prime minister is willing to commit suicide politically in order to keep the euro going. I think it's a waste, right? What you want the Slovakian prime minister to be doing is committing political suicide, if she has to, in order to achieve something positive, not to keep current policies in place, right? It is a black hole of political capital, the euro, because nobody can do anything in Europe because they have to spend all their political capital to keep it going. Fourth, it undermines the reputation of all the great things Europe is doing. Suppose there had been no euro, and we just thought about the last 2 decades. Completion of the single market, the Schengen zone, lots of regulatory policies, the neighborhood policy with some successes like Morocco, 70% of global foreign aid, lots of foreign policy successes in international organization like the ICC, military intervention capacity that nobody even imagined they would have 20 years ago, places like Libya and Afghanistan, and most importantly, enlargement from 12 countries to 27, the single most cost-effective instrument for spreading peace and security and prosperity in the world since the end of the Cold War. And what's the reputation of Europe today? It's a basket case. Why? Because of the euro. The euro undermines the way people perceive Europe everywhere in the world. In 2007, I spent a year in China. Everybody wanted to know about Europe because it seemed like a great success. Now they don't because this policy's in the tank. Best do something about it. Now, if the euro isn't a good policy and Europe really isn't doing anything about it but just saying more of the same, austerity in the south, continue, muddle through, why not? Final point. 2 reasons. 1, there are short-term costs. So politicians never like a policy option where you say there are large short-term costs, but in the long term, there are benefits, right? And it's certainly true with the euro that pulling out and rearranging things or reducing the number of countries in the euro or fundamentally rearranging the way it works would be costly in the short term, but good in the long term. This is, of course, ironic because the original argument for the euro was short-term pain, but this will be an economically healthy policy for you, so we've reversed things. But politicians shy away from that. But the second reason, and the one that I think should really hit Luke where it hurts, is European ideology. Europeans still believe, and even the pragmatic ones like Luke, who don't believe all that Habermasian stuff about how we have to have a big jump to federal union. All Europeans believe once you have a European policy in place, it's got to stay in place, and it would be an admission of failure to get rid of it. Now, in most healthy democratic societies, you have policies, you promulgate policies. If they're good policies, you expand them. If they're bad policies, they go away. And Europe's been around longer than most democracies on the earth today. It's a stable arrangement. It's not going to collapse. So you'd think Europeans would have the confidence to say, this isn't such a good policy, we should cut it back. But no. Europeans judge the success of their own enterprise in terms of whether the euro continues. So at the end of the day, despite what he tells you about the circles and everything, I think that Luke is a covert idealist, like most Europeans are, and that is hurting the European project.
All right, Dan. All right. So first, let me just say, about the book. It was a real pleasure to read. Well written. It's very erudite, and it's all the more impressive for, as we learn now, having been written before you worked at the council, because it's full of lots of tidbits and insider anecdotes. So it shows you were very thorough in your research, and so it's certainly far more interesting read and enjoyable read than many of the kind of broad overviews of the history of European integration. And so for that, all that, congratulations. And now you may be suspecting the criticism is coming. And while there was very much that I liked in it, let me raise some sort of challenges and critiques to some of the points you make there. And even before I do that, let me just make an aside, because you say in the book, and you said here again, that you really wanted to distance yourself, even though you don't engage them so directly. You kind of you basically dismiss the sort of main theories of European integration, or the ones that played a central role in debates in the past couple of decades: intergovernmentalism, supranationalism, as you call it, etc. That being said, I would say that there's a sense in which the book, I think, can be read as very much an intergovernmentalist take, although not so much a liberal intergovernmentalist, but it is, I think, heavily intergovernmentalist, which is interesting because you're sort of claiming that you dismiss that, but I'm not so sure that the content of the book is consistent with that dismissal. Okay, so here on my critiques. Let me start with one general point. One of the emphases in the book is on the importance of contingency, and this is part of why you sort of reject some of the general theories of European integration. You say that any understanding of politics or of European integration has to look at events, as you say, the contingencies, things that come up and leaders have to react, and these kind of unpredictable events are what drive the process and the way leaders at the table react to them, and you tell stories in very compelling fashion about these late night meetings and what was decided and who said what. And without question, of course, events and contingency plays a huge role in politics, otherwise we could predict the future forever, right? And we can't. That being said, I would just like to say that I think sometimes things that look like unexpected contingencies and that can be treated that way in an analysis, well, maybe that's the wrong way to think about them. Maybe they're anything but that. So take the Greek crisis. You can talk about that as an unexpected contingency. Suddenly we get this report. I'd say there's nothing unexpected about the Greek crisis. To the contrary, it was the Greek crisis or something like it. It could have been the Portuguese crisis first. The timing, who came first, could have varied. But some kind of crisis like that was an inevitable consequence of flaws in the design of governance of the Eurozone put in place in the Maastricht Treaty. And I remember meetings. I was working at Center for European Policy Studies, Daniel Gross back in 1996, were talking about the Maastricht Treaty and the design and all these things about the mechanisms for enforcing the Stability and Growth Pact, and everyone said, well, there's no way this will ever work if there's really going to be a crisis, et cetera. So I think some things that look like a contingency that are so unpredictable are actually inevitable consequences of institutional designs that are put in place. In this case, basically, when you combine free movement of capital, a common currency, and subunit, i.e. member state, not EU, control over fiscal policy, then if you don't have a credible way to constrain the deficits of those national capitals, then inevitably you're going to get some kind of state debt crisis. And you get them in all federal systems. Brazil had it. The US, we had it in the 1840s. The exact same thing happened in the US in the 1840s, except we had far less solidarity than Europe has today. Washington told the states in the 1840s to go to hell, basically, and 8 states defaulted, right? And anyway, I can tell that whole story, but it's interesting that we had far less solidarity. Of course, our federation failed 20 years later. Now, back to my second point. One part of the book you didn't talk much about here, which I really enjoyed, was the third section where you talk about these 3 different strategies for how to legitimate or gain public support for the European project. You talk about an identity-based German strategy, a kind of utility-based Roman strategy, and finally a more sort of democracy and participation-based, what you call a Greek strategy. The idea that you need to involve people through European elections or some kind of European democratic participation in the European process in order to get their support for this project. Now, in discussing that, you kind of dismissive of the European Parliament, as you said, wasn't mentioned, and in general, you seem to believe, if I'm reading right, that there should be more of a role for national parliaments in the European political process as a way to involve citizens and get their democratic participation. And you speak approvingly of things in the Lisbon Treaty like the yellow card. This is where national parliaments can try to block a commission proposal if they think it's taking too much national power, infringing on subsidiarity. Well, I think all these kind of calls, this is where I really have to disagree with you, for involving national parliaments more at the EU level are totally wrong-headed, really. Because, and what they point to is sort of misunderstanding. Andy's written very convincingly about why he thinks there isn't a democratic deficit at the EU level, and I sort of agree, but maybe for a different reason. To me, what these claims show is that the big democratic deficit in Europe is at the national level, not at the EU level. What do I mean? Well, first of all, national parliaments, if they could control their own governments, which they're supposed to in theory, but in practice they don't, then they wouldn't need to ask to be involved again at the EU level somehow directly, because after all, the national governments are sent there as representatives of their parliaments, right? Because most of you are in parliamentary systems here. So national parliaments can't control their governments. That's not the EU's fault, it's their fault, okay? Because of flaws in, I don't know if we want to get into how parliamentary systems work in Europe, but that's the real democratic deficit, is that they don't control their parliaments. There's some exceptions, like the Danish Folketing, but mostly they don't. And bodies like the Assemblée Nationale, do we really want to give them a role at the EU level? I mean, it's a joke, the Assemblée, right? And in fact, those national parliaments are jealous of the European Parliament because it's much more powerful than they are. It really amends legislation in a much more powerful way, and the European Parliament's a real parliament, okay, or a real legislative body with big impact on legislation, unlike most of the national parliaments. Secondly, the second respect in which I think there's a democratic deficit at the national level is, keep in mind, we're seeing this now with Hungary, in the conflict between the EU and Hungary. The EU has a big role to play in safeguarding democracy in Europe against national governments who might stray from democracy. We didn't think about that in the Europe of 6, but certainly in the enlarged EU, particularly with Hungary, but also with Romania and others, this is a real issue. And there, by the way, it's interesting what we're seeing in terms of leadership and where the action is, and here I do mean no offense, but what has Van Rompuy said about Hungary? Nothing, basically, nothing. Where has the critique come from? Viviane Reding in the Commission, the Justice Minister, and Barroso, who are going hard against Hungary. Van Rompuy can't because he's the president of the Council, where the member state governments, including Orban, the dictator, sit, right? And so he's not really in the position to critique. But anyway, and finally,
It's your bad luck that the two Hungarians here.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, and finally, I think, in terms of this question, here, maybe take a step back, just thinking about, this question, is there a democratic deficit? Is the EU not doing what citizens want? I think we often look at the wrong numbers in polling and stuff if we want to think about this. Sure, the EU is not very popular. That's true, and it's gone down a lot, as you said, unprecedented drop in support for the EU, etc. But the EU is still more trusted than national parliaments or national governments. Okay, they've dropped as well. Oh, I can guarantee you, except in some countries, yeah. But on average across Europe, it isn't. In the best governed countries, trust for national parliaments is higher. But in many of the countries, it's just the opposite, where trust in the EU is dramatically higher than trust in their own institutions, right? And they want the EU to save them from themselves. And it's not just countries like Hungary. I mean, the EU, yeah, you could say, yeah, Britain also, and you could say the EU, I guess most people would say this is undemocratic, but let's face it, the EU helped save Italy from Berlusconi, right? And they didn't manage to do that themselves, okay? Because he owned the media, among other things. Okay, so, yeah, the EU is more popular than national governments, more trusted than national governments or national parliaments. And also, I think national governments and the council often block the EU from doing the things the citizens want it to do. So look at polling. How many Europeans favor having a common defense and security policy at the EU level? 73%. Okay, 73% versus 20% who don't. What stops that from happening? Member states. And that's fine, they can do that, right? The governments. But are they listening to their people? No, right? Common foreign policy, 64% want it, okay? So again and again, I mean, I think democratic deficit in terms of the EU not responding to citizen wants is often, those problems are often rooted in national governments. Okay? Now, do I have like a minute left? I'm going too long. Okay, a couple last points. Okay, okay, now I'm getting hesitant to do this because this maybe seems too direct, but another thing that came up for me is in looking at your interpretation of the institutional reforms in Lisbon, and here it's understandable. You have let's say you're given your explanation. It's understandable that you looking to the council, the European Council, to provide leadership, and the President of the Council to provide leadership for the EU, and you sort of posit it as an alternative to the Commission presidency as a source of leadership for the EU. And that's certainly how it was billed when it was put in the treaties. My interpretation is that it hasn't worked out so well, and I didn't think it would at the time. I mean, it's not a coincidence that it was designed, this office, by a Frenchman, right? Because what have they done? They basically turned the EU into a kind of semi-presidential system, in a sense, where you have two people vying for leadership, right? The President of the Council and the President of the Commission. And that, I think, is going to become more tense after next year, because you may have heard that in European Parliament elections in 2014, right, the parties in the Parliament are going to put forward candidates for the Commission presidency ahead of the election and try to turn it into a real pan-European election for the Commission president to try to give more legitimacy to that office. We'll see how that goes, but they're trying. And I think you can just foresee, I'm sorry?
It's just terrible.
It might be a bad idea, we'll see. But I'm saying that you're going to potentially have this real conflict between whoever's appointed as the council president and the commission president. You could see, because the commission president is going to, the idea is that it'll be really a politically responsible office. So it'll be a socialist, social democrat, or Christian Democrat responsible to a parliament of that majority, right? Well, what if the council president's from a different party, right? You can see tensions down the road. So I think actually Van Rompuy's done a good job in the office, but I think the office as such is potentially a problematic structure for the EU system going forward. And the last thing I'll end with on a positive note, you make some comparisons which I found very interesting with the US in the book, and I appreciated those. But just a couple of last thoughts on that. If we do think of the EU, whatever it is and wherever it's going, and Andy might not like it if I make a federal comparison, but if we do think of the EU in those kind of federal terms, there's only been 3 federal systems in history, or quasi-federal systems, that are what Al Stepan would call coming together federalisms, where previously independent countries come together to form some kind of federal system. Those 3 are Switzerland, the US, and the EU. The first two of those didn't manage to do it peacefully. Switzerland had to have a war to do it. The Sonderbundskrieg only lasted for like a week or something. It wasn't that big of a deal, but they did have to have violence. The US, of course, we fudged it at the beginning, and the question of where sovereignty lay was fudged, and then was only basically sorted out at the end of the barrel of a gun in the Civil War, right? And so the EU, in a sense, is doing quite well. That wherever it's going, and I'm not saying it's going completely in a federal direction, but wherever it's going, it's doing it peacefully. It's doing it quite rapidly, I would say, compared to any of those historic experiences. And to me, when there's this discussion about the fundamental problems of the EU, I don't view it as having really fundamental problems. I think the EU is doing pretty well, all things considered. Anyone who's going to build a currency union is going to have big bumps along the way. As I said, in the US, on the way to building our currency union, we had defaults of the states, we had a civil war. So the EU, in that kind of comparative historical perspective, I think is doing pretty well, all things considered.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Andy.
Luke, any things that you've been hit where it hurts? Do you want to quickly hit back before we open it up, or shall we open it up right away?
What do you prefer?
Up to you.
Well, I mean, there's so many points I won't be able to take up all of it. How much time do we have? 15 minutes, including.
A little bit more. But why don't we take a couple of questions and then give you the chance to maybe bundle a couple of issues together. So we have not 20% first.
I would like to make a short remark on Andrew Moravcsik's reaction to the party, the anti-Euro party in Germany, which has just not crossed the 5% threshold. As a chairman, 50-year-old professor of economics who made just the argument that you have developed. We are very much in favor of Europe, and in order to develop Europe, we should just reconfigure this technical issue with the euro, and then we can continue with the European integration. This didn't resonate, or at least created some distrust in the German public, although it did resonate, it almost went through. And my sense is that Germans and others feel that this is not the euro is not any institution which can easily be reconfigured. I know that the euro has started to be conceived before the German unification, but the big push was the German unification. And one of the reasons, and even before German unification, other states were deeply uncomfortable with the dominance of the German mark, which they wanted to get rid of. And they got rid of it by the euro. And it is one of the concessions. So I think if the others would all agree, Germany would not, for technical reasons, object. But this is one of the issues where sort of idealism and realistic interests come together, where everybody feels if we dismantle that, it may create the crack. And so I sympathize with your reaction, but I think it is not situated in the sort of realistic political constellation which from which it has developed. So I very much agree with Luuk van Middelaar in his sort of effort to try to continue to know this.
You just said the same thing I did. It's
In a
not,
sense,
it's
in
not
a
a
sense,
self-interested policy, except if you're German. So
I
of
know.
course they can't. I mean, if I were German, I wouldn't vote for it either, right? Because Germans are benefiting from it.
No.
But there are ideological reasons why people don't see their way clear to look at this policy the way it should be looked at. And the most important of them is the misconception that if you did something about the euro, it would call the whole thing into question. Right? And as long as people believe that, then it seems like a rational policy to stick with a policy that isn't a good one. But the real mystery isn't Germans, the real mystery is Italian.
Luke, do you want to react to this? And then
Yeah, well,
maybe
maybe
you
just
said earlier.
briefly on this discussion. I mean, it's not only German voters who have had a chance to have to say about the future of their country as regards the euro. I mean, the Greek voters also voted ultimately in favor of staying within the eurozone a year ago. They could have voted more massively for the left-wing party who wanted to leave. They did not. Were they just lured into it, or did they make a rational choice for their country because they feel that for a country like Greece of 10 million people in today's world, it is important to be part of a bigger structure, that they also want to be part of the monetary side of that with its constraints, and they know it is painful, and the Greeks, it's not the case for all the countries in trouble, but the Greek population blames above all its own political class and not Brussels for what is happening, because they know they are in a close to fail state. I indeed believe that, like the German voters, they make a sound choice, and they are not deceived on purpose by whoever. Maybe two comments then. One on what Professor Nolte said and linked to your. It's so. I find it indeed very easy to say, well, let's just liquidate the whole thing, and then what? It's that is the real black hole decision, and that's fine to say that here in Princeton. But if you say that as a leader of a country, I mean, you are politically dead after the state.
Of course. Yeah. That's what you wanted the Slovakian woman to do, and she did it. So
yeah.
Maybe it's a courageous decision.
Well, but the question, that is not only because of you will be politically attacked, but maybe also for good reasons, because the risk is real, and the belief. It's a little bit simple to dismiss the belief that the euro is important as just a belief. You know as well as we all do that emotions and identities and beliefs are very, very much part of the fabric of where you have to deal with as a politician. And you cannot say that Europe is just an ideology people should stop believing it, be it Germans or Italians.
No, I'm saying they should believe in it, but they should be discriminating about what they associate with it. But look, take an American example of this. You know, Americans have the bad habit of getting into wars. Okay, stupid wars. So Vietnam, Iraq, and so on. And the same thing always happens about 3 years into the war, which is people wake up and they say, this was a stupid war. And even the people who started the war won't defend the decision to get into the war. Instead, what they say is, it's yesterday's news to defend whether it was a good idea to get into the war, but now that we're in the war, it would be a mistake to suddenly pull out, because we're committed to it and these people are depending on us now. And then all of a sudden, 10 years later, you're still in the war, right? With more people dying. More people dying after we decided it was a bad idea to be in Vietnam than before we decided it was a bad idea to be in Vietnam, which was 1968, right? So, now Europe, to their credit, is very discriminating about when it gets involved in wars, but it isn't so discriminating about when it gets involved in institutional commitments. And they treat the euro a little bit like Americans treat wars, which is once you're in it, you suspend disbelief about whether it's a good idea. And I don't think that's a good idea.
If I could just interject, I mean, I think the one place I challenge that is that I think really what it boils down to is the exit costs. And if you're right that, there'd be some short-term exit costs, but the long-term would be better, then maybe your position is plausible. In my view, the exit costs are prohibitive, right? So would it have been better if Greece or Italy hadn't joined the euro, or at least not at the point they did? Yeah, I think probably, right? But I think at this point the exit costs are absolutely prohibitive, so that for me it's just a non-starter, and that's my take.
Okay,
Okay, but
just remember, that's up against 10 or 15 years of essentially zero growth, all right? And that's a big cost.
But for many countries, take Greece, I mean, for 50% of its existence as a country, it's been in default. A lot of these countries, we're tending to blame the problems on the euro now, and I don't think they're all the fault of the euro. Spain had 22% unemployment through most of the 90s, right? So it's like, they would have a whole new set of terrible problems, high interest rates. I mean, Greeks couldn't import like gasoline, for instance, because they'd have no money. And, so they would substitute one set of problems with another set of problems. And maybe you're right that they'd be worse, but I'm not totally convinced, but maybe. Luuk.
Yeah, well, the point I agree on with Andrew is on the challenge today of competitiveness. That is the heart of today's economic problems, is to bring back growth and employment thanks to better economic policies and the private sector. And the euro has not caused these problems, here I agree with you, but has in a way, for countries like Spain and Greece, worked as a kind of sleeping pill, which allowed to hide bad policy, because it gave cheap money for everybody, which resulted in a combination of dangerous public and private debt. More public debt in the Greek case, more private debt in Spanish or Irish cases. I just want to come back to one of Daniel Kelemen's point on public legitimacy and the way you look at national and parliaments and the European Parliament. There, I disagree, and I think you are a little bit too far away here from the way national parliaments work and how they are, whether you like it or not, the heart of the political systems in all these countries. If you are an ambitious politician in any European country, you don't go to the European Parliament, because it's exile, it's political exile. I mean, remember, that's why Rachida Dati was sent by Sarkozy when she fell out of grace as justice minister. In the case of the Netherlands, my country, it's a punitive colony. I mean, the only prime ministers you find, former prime ministers you find in the European Parliament are basically former Belgian prime ministers. Well, they have been honest, sorry, for them it's convenient because they can still be close to their grandchildren. What I mean is that the European Parliament is miles away from average public opinion. So you cannot, with all the decisions that are being taken, with some of which are, substantive policy decisions about billions of euros, you cannot build that on a body which, even if it's directly elected, which is good, and it is, of course, formally legitimate, and it plays an important role within the balance of power in Brussels institutions, but it does not bring the vox populi into the policy spheres. It is regrettable, but it is a fact. So for that to happen, it would require for 500 million Europeans who now, first of all, consider themselves to be Czechoslovaks, Hungarians, etc., to be, first of all, European. Because ultimately you can only build a European government on the credibility of speaking on behalf of Europeans as Europeans, whereas now people are Europeans only, in French I would say, par nation interposée, so basically European because you are.
Just a very short question to the panel. We just had elections in Germany. We'll probably have a grand coalition very soon. And I would be very curious on what you would advise to Chancellor Merkel, especially when it comes to dealing with France, on how to move forward, because I think the case scenario, which is realistic, is we will have another bailout package for Greece and Portugal soon. We might have a haircut for Greece after 2 or 3 years. We will have the euro also in 20 years, and there will be not a dropping of this project. So within this framework, I would be very, very interested in your opinion what Chancellor Merkel should do with France to move forward within this scenario, not within the we kill the euro, because I think it's not realistic. Thank you.
In the German interest or in the European interest?
In the European interest, because the German and the European interest is aligned.
Oh, really? That's news to me.
Well, I think that Chancellor Merkel and the German political class more widely regrets the lack of France as a partner as strong as France used to be. So what she probably is telling President Hollande is that they really want, the Germans want and many others want the French to get their economy going again and to do more on structural economic reforms and as the foundation of better cooperation. Because the balance which there was for long, of course, is now gone, and Germans find that very uncomfortable to have to lead. And I believe that they prefer to have France by their side. But that will require hard work also on the French side.
So on my reading, if you think it's about divergence, then you have to ask yourself what the source of the divergence is in Europe that would make this stable. So you could talk about this for a long time, but to make it, to make it vulgarly simple, Germany would need to move resources out of the tradable sector of the economy into the non-tradable sector of the economy, and then countries in the South need to do the opposite. Everybody focuses on the countries in the South doing the opposite, finding a way to reorient their economies to become more export competitive and stop spending money on houses in Spain and so on. Very few people focus on Germany doing its part to adjust. If you actually take a 2% inflation rate, which is what the ECB was supposed to be targeting, Germany's almost as far under that over the last 10 years as the southern countries are over it. So if you think that the divergence is the source of the problem and makes this unsustainable over time, Germany would have to adjust as much as the other countries if it were to be fair and European and solidaristic, right? So that's something that Merkel actually controls to a greater extent than what goes on in Portugal. So the Germans should think about how they're going to adjust their economy away from export industry and toward the domestic economy. And given the last 50 years of Germany, I would say good luck with that.
If I could add something, I agree very much with what Andy just said there, and I think Grand Coalition bode well for this. I mean, one thing beside shifted sectors, you need wages to go up in Germany, and they've been, basically unit labor costs diverged incredibly, and that was part of the key of the crisis. And one way to address the divergence in unit labor costs is to give Germans raises. And I'll tell you something that Germans like more than austerity. It's a holiday in the Mediterranean. And basically, they need to earn a bit more money, go spend some more of it on a holiday in Greece or Italy or Portugal. It's also nice, Spain. And that would be good for convergence. But I think also, just in terms of another thing where the Grand Coalition bodes well, there's been a lot of talk, and from Schäuble you heard things which I think we're not going to hear in the new coalition, against banking union, etc. We're going to see banking union within a couple of years. I think that I would bet the farm on that. We don't need to see euro bonds, people are talking about, because we already have euro bonds. When Draghi says, I'll do whatever it takes, i.e. I'll buy as much Italian debt as I need to, then Italian debt becomes European debt, basically, right? Now you can say he's not just going to print money, but I think we know what it means. So we already have quasi-euro bonds in the sense that national bonds are backed by the ECB.
I finally discovered that I do believe in the European cause. And it doesn't hurt me if you say that. Because, of course, I mean, that's the work I do, that's the book I've written, that's something I in a way identify with. But I believe in that in Europe, not in the leap way and in the simplified idealistic way of some of these people, but in a more historic and I think political way in the importance of the countries and peoples on that nice continent to do work more together. And I'm not afraid to say that, I'm not ashamed of that.
And now, please join me in thanking our speakers for